And so the original intent for the CMMC framework was to protect specifically the CUI and the FCI data, and to do so using the strict standards that NIST 171 has inside of an enclave that is carved out for specifically any data revolving around the CUI and the FCI. And so what the framework intended to do was to protect just that data. And I think where the confusion has come in place is people are saying, well, all of my entire organization needs to be NIST 171, NIST 172, or CMMC level 1, level 2, level 3 compliant, where in reality, the CUI and the FCI that you are specifically managing as an MSP and specifically for that customer is what is the focus of the CMMC framework.
What is CMMC? How does it apply to you as a managed service provider? And with all of this discussion around deregulation and changing the role and the function of federal government here in the United States, it brings up a very real question of what should the managed services profession be doing to prepare for a future where CMMC might be changing in very big ways. And we're going to explain exactly what that means. And if this is your first time tuning into the MSP Zone, this is what we do, is we cover these very difficult topics. We break them down, make them very simple. And so you can understand them and make rational decisions for the future for yourself, for your MSP practice, and for your customers. I've asked someone who has a ton of experience in the field of not just CMMC, but in the field of MSP certification and audit, our very own Senior Director of our certification program, Chris Vio. Chris, welcome to the MSP Zone.
Hey, Charles, it is a privilege to be here on the MSP Zone.
Your first time, so I appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule, because I know you work a lot with our members, MSPs all over the world. So you're going to have a lot of, I think, very relevant experience. I don't, my own understanding of CMMC is, it started to really emerge pre-pandemic. It was, hey, we want to. Maybe I'll start with you. What's your opinion of CMMC and where it came from? Because you're a former military guy and you have family members who are in and around the service still. But what does CMMC mean to you?
A good question. So CMMC is a cybersecurity framework that is solely focused on protecting domestic IT infrastructure and U.S. infrastructure regarding classified on CUI and FCI data, and the customers and the contractors that use that data to produce products for Department of Defense and just in general, the defense industrial base.
So it is relegated specifically to, we call it the DIB, but, defense industrial base. We are talking about supply chain companies that feed up into the Department of Defense. It is not just the Department of Defense only, correct?
Correct.
I think a lot of people get confused about that because they say, well, my customer isn't the Department of Defense, but they might make a ball bearing, right, that the Department of Defense uses somewhere down the line, and that's where the implications come in.
Agreed.
So it's a framework, it's a set of controls based off of NIST, and we've been doing a lot of work. You and your team here at MSPAlliance have been doing a ton of work on helping MSPs, get aligned with and getting their customers aligned with CMMC. We'll get into more of that in a moment, but walk us through CMMC is not an MSP framework. Maybe you could talk about what is CMMC and how does it impact a typical MSP versus an MSP's customer? Because I think there's a lot of confusion out there about, who it's really designed for and what the kind of responsibilities are depending on that organization.
Yes. So like you said, it's a derivative of the NIST framework, right? So it's coming from the NIST 171 and 172 framework. And so the original intent for the CMMC framework was to protect specifically the CUI and the FCI data, and to do so using the strict standards that NIST 171 has inside of an enclave that is carved out for specifically any data revolving around the CUI and the FCI. And so what the framework intended to do was to protect just that data. And I think where the confusion has come in place is people are saying, well, all of my entire organization needs to be NIST 171, NIST 172, or CMMC level 1, level 2, level 3 compliance, where in reality, the CUI and the FCI that you are specifically managing as an MSP and specifically for that customer is what is the focus of the CMMC frame.
So what I'm getting from you, Chris, is that there could be a variety of different approaches that an MSP takes, both for their internal controls, but also for the guidance and the advice they give to customers who may not, right? A managed services customer may not have all of their revenue coming from the DIB. It could be like 10%. That's what I'm hearing from you, is that you wouldn't necessarily have to have the whole of your operation swing towards a CMMC framework. Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
In your experience, is that what's happening? Do you think MSPs and their customers are trying to partition that out, or are they doing it like all in or nothing at all?
I think it's a mixed bag. Is some customers, some MSPs are recognizing that this is nothing new. Access control and asset management, configuration management and incident response and internal auditing. These concepts that CMMC is trying to drive home isn't a new field of work for them. They've been doing it all along. And so what they're recognizing is it's not jump the gun and do an entire revision of our entire organization. Let's start with an enclave. Let's start with carving out just the CUI and the FCI. And then we'll work and expand our compliance from there. And then on the other hand, you have some MSPs who may not be very versed in the compliance world. And so they're getting what they think is a framework that's designed to protect the whole organization and designed to benefit the MSP, where in reality, it's only meant to benefit the DIB.
So, okay, so I'd like your opinion on this, because I've heard from a lot of people who are so-called experts who say, if you're an MSP, you should be, and you have even one customer, and I've even heard it applied to non-DIB practices, meaning the MSP doesn't have any exposure to DIB clientele. They're just saying, you ought to be focused on CMMC because it's a good framework. You're saying, and I don't disagree with you, there's a lot that CMMC might not even cover that would be necessary for you to run a good MSP practice. Did I get that right?
I think you got that right.
Okay. What would you, you do a lot of work on this every day. I mean, do you have this conversation with MSPs, and what's their response to that? Are they familiar with this concept? Because it's kind of hard to think of, why would the federal government come up with something that actually doesn't cover the entirety of what I do as an MSP?
Yeah, I think that once they understand that compliance isn't just a check the box situation, it's total governance, and it's designed to protect the information that we hold value to and that your organization holds value to. And with the framework of CMMC, it's specifically the information that the government holds value to. And so as an MSP, you may be providing quite a bit of resources to these DIB contractors or these DIB companies, but only a small component of that is actually FCI or actually CUI. And so I think the epiphany that they have when I'm discussing it with them is the proper scoping of that CUI is the first step. Where is that CUI? What does it touch? Who does it touch? And how are my tools that I'm using to deliver services interacting with that data, because that's not clear yet, but it will be as CMMC begins to mature and that responsibility starts to get partitioned out to the tools that we use daily.
Yeah. I mean, boy, there's a whole bunch there that I think we could spend a couple of hours on just the work that MSPs could do armed with that information that you just spoke of, where their customer comes, because this is what I hear is the customers come to us and they say, the MSPs come to us saying, my customer just had a conversation with me. We need to help them get CMMC compliant. What do we need to do? Right. And that sets the spark of, tell me how much I need to spend to solve that problem. And you're giving a very rational approach, which is, well, do you even know how much CUI is being exposed? Where is it? Is it your infrastructure? Is it the third-party cloud? I mean, there's so many different things that the MSP could do to help their customers without having to just go overboard and just put the entire organization with CMMC controls.
Agreed. Yes. Yeah, I think that there's a logical sequence to adopting that methodology.
Yeah. There have been, my words, maybe not anyone else's or yours, a lot of start-stop with CMMC. Like there's been a lot of revisions. There's been a lot of, just the evolution that it's gone through since it was formally announced, over 5 years ago now, I think. What's your impression of where we are today in terms of CMMC being implemented and the, maybe just high level, just speak to the levels and what the general requirements are, if you can.
Yeah, I believe that they just finished up the rulemaking process. And so with that finishing, the CMMC level 3 has been announced and released. And I think the compliance experts are still trying to digest and get a handle on how to tackle that for the prime companies that will need that. But as an MSP, most likely your central focus will be CMMC level 1, and that's a self-attestment. And then the CMMC level 2 self-attestment, which will be for your customers, but also for you managing any of that data that your customer's using.
So if I'm not mistaken, it started off with 5 levels, and then we went down to 2 levels, and then we're back up to 3. Is that right?
They originally had 5 levels, and then they said, we're going to do a CMMC 2.0, and that condensed it down to 3 levels. And the confusion with the 3rd level is that it took them a long time to release level 3. And so they released both the rulemaking process and level 3 basically in the same month. And so now we're faced with 3 levels. Level 3 is a certification that requires an assessor to come and do the assessment. Then you have your OSC, which is that organization seeking certification for level 2. And then everything else is an OSA, which is that organization seeking assessment. And that has a level 1 and a level 2 component.
Got it. We have certainly been doing a lot of work in preparing MSPs and their customers for level 1, level 2. Walk us, because I want to prepare the viewers listening and watching this for what is potentially to come. But I think they need to understand what is currently being done. So our approach, you want to talk about our approach as it relates to CMMC, because it is very different, chiefly because we're an MSP community. Do you want to just talk about the UCS and its relationship to CMMC? I think that'll be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, so the UCS is going to be a MSP-specific compliance framework that cross-maps to not just NIST 171 and NIST 172, but also NIST 853, which is the original derivation that the NIST 171 came from, and the CIS framework, the ISO framework, and the trust services criteria, right? So that's SOC 2. And so your organization is going to be going through total body governance, down from how you run your organization to the way that policies and procedures are written and then followed and then implemented. And then the big one, which is how you classify and protect data, and the change management and the operations that you're running through on a day-to-day basis. And how you're doing information security and protecting all of that data, all that precious data that the customer is trusting you with, and making sure that that data has integrity and it's backed up. And then, where the UCS framework really takes a leap ahead of all the other ones is it's contractually based by master service agreements, and you as an MSP having a master service agreement or contracts that define the services that you're providing to customers is really the difference between these other frameworks, which are very technical and very IT focused, generally speaking, or cybersecurity focused, but they don't play well with the ability for the MSP to function and be efficient at delivering managed services from that contractually obligated commitment you make to the client.
I really like that the last part you said, not to throw too much personal perspective, but I mean the CMMC and a lot of these other frameworks were never designed for efficiency, right? They're designed for security, and that doesn't mean that you can't also be efficient. But as an MSP, you have to be efficient and secure, and do both at the same time. You can't be good at what you do by just being secure and being highly ineffective or unscalable, because ultimately that's going to put someone at risk or multiple customers at risk. I'd like to turn a little bit. So now the audience has a general idea of where we are. We're still in an evolutionary period, it sounds like, with CMMC. There's still more unknowns to be resolved. Is that true? Is that your understanding?
I think the next step for CMMC is to see how the cost associated with achieving it is going to play out, as well as how well, and this is something that I think about quite often, but how well are the tools that not only the MSP or the MSSP, but also the defense industrial base in general uses that sit on top of CUI? How well are those tools going to play with the certification?
Are you talking about outdated, legacy, highly insecure systems that nobody wants to touch or update because the cost in upgrading a AS400 or some other archaic machine that's running some archaic database, nobody wants to touch this thing because they don't want to break it? I just want to make sure I'm getting it.
I think we're going to see an interesting, as 2025 comes around and those assessors start going on site and start looking at people's security plans, the unknowns that we're discussing, I think, will start to really form and become not only pinch points, but milestones for the certification to grow.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good pivot point. So we're shifting now to the future, and we're just going to have opinions. I'm going to get your opinions first. No politics, right? Politics are off the table here. Politics aside, it's hard for anybody in the world to look at what is happening and not expect that there's going to be a massive, at least a review and a very bright light shown on the defense industrial base, the DoD, and many other ancillary government agencies in our U.S. federal government system, just to look at what is it that you do and are you efficient? And if you're not efficient, why should we keep you? Politics aside, that has got to be something that is going to have some impact on CMMC and how it's being enforced. What's your take on that, Chris?
I think that deregulation is probably coming to not just manufacturing and some of the verticals that the CMMC world is going to kind of lean on, but also government cutting of some of the unnecessary bloat that the certification is going to bring, because there's going to be a rush to sell products and sell tools that maybe deliver some of the controls that CMMC is gonna be checking. But the MSP is going to have to step outside of where the government has placed them, which is in one column of a shared responsibility matrix, because they put the highest value on the data itself, and the MSP is just somebody who's in their eyes delivering that service.
Okay. You just touched on two massively important things here that I don't think get talked a lot about. I mean, maybe there's some DoD conference in Fort Meade, Maryland, where they get together and they talk about these types of internal federal policies. But in the MSP community, I don't hear it a lot. But number one is the internal inefficiency and what I would call the lack of scalability of the CMMC testing and enforcement model. They nothing to say about the quality of the controls, right? The controls are fine. Their enforcement methodology, I think, is lacking and has been proven already to be highly cost ineffective and not scalable. Any thoughts on that?
I totally agree. That's why they surprised us with a level 2 self-assessment when the rulemaking finished. Unless you were very deep inside of that world, day in and day out, following the rulemaking process, you would have never expected a CMMC level 2 self-assessment to come out of the framework as fast as it did. But that is, I think, their knee-jerk reaction to saying, wait a second, the person who's making a ball bearing might not have $50,000 to get certified in CMMC.
Somebody talked to him, though. Someone must have said, guys, I am not going to do this. Terminate my contract and go get your ball bearing somewhere else. I mean, that must have been happening on a massive scale, right? I mean, had to have been.
It had to have been.
Which is in itself a risk, right? I mean, you could, through enforcement, cut off your supply chain to the point where nobody can achieve the compliance goal that you've set, and therefore nobody stays in the supply chain. Which, if they all suddenly left and you had a supply chain shortage in certain areas, that could be very not ideal. I mean, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. And so I think one thing that is a positive for MSPs, and especially MSPs that are going to be looking for good talent in the future here, is that the government is going to realize, just like they did with IBAS and the manufacturing component of the government's DIB, that they need to press internal. We need to beef up our industrial base, and so we're also going to need to beef up our information security and IT base coming from domestic U.S. resources, because there's going to be a lot of MSPs that are going to have to show that only domestic or that U.S. domestic resources are working inside the CUI, inside the FCI environment.
Yeah, I think that there is a large community out there of MSPs who have customers who have been. Yeah, I'm going to use the example. I hate to use AS400 because I don't want to knock it. It in its time, it was a very powerful system. It may be very powerful now. I know it still is used, but that and other kind of older, outdated, not just hardware but software is sitting out there in the DIB, and MSPs have been, because we've heard it, right? We've heard all these stories of MSPs saying, I have to manage this weird system that was built in the 60s, and nobody wants to update it because nobody wants to break it, and even if they did, there's no budget for it. I think there isn't a lack of MSPs knowing what needs to be done. I think there's a lack of empowerment for the MSPs to tell the customer, look, this is not safe. We need to get you squared away and get you upgraded. And I think that was one of the things that was nice about CMMC, is it started to have that conversation,
Yes, agreed. And the MSPs that are looking, if you're an MSP and you're looking at keeping a client, really keeping or taking on a new client who's saying we need CMMC compliance, having a general just pulse check or assessment that you run in the onboarding process, like you would if you were seeking the certification with MSPAlliance, to understand and to properly scope out and to be the voice of reason to the customer and say, hey, look, I know you're getting hounded by the government for CMMC compliance. We're going to provide a lot of this infrastructure for you. We are compliant. We can help you drown the noise out of these 110 controls that you're being faced with in the CMMC framework.
So I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that we are saying that CMMC is doomed to go away, because I honestly don't know. It's issues, and every framework has its issues, areas that could be improved. And this is a relatively new one, so they're trying to make up things that other frameworks have already figured out. We don't want to insinuate that the need to improve our cyber defenses in the DIB is not a noble, not even noble. It's a necessary thing. We all know this, right? I mean, Chris, you're in the military. We need to raise the defenses seriously.
Absolutely. 100%.
But we also don't want MSPs or their customers to say, well, the government hasn't officially made anything real concrete, therefore let's wait. I think waiting is not the outcome here either, right?
No, it's not, because you're going to want to get ahead of the game by start somewhere. Start with a cybersecurity framework somewhere, whether it's the UCS or CIS or NIST or SOC 2. Start there, because the CMMC world didn't invent cyber compliance. They only mimicked all the other frameworks that have been doing this for decades. And so largely, if you're compliant with one of these industry standard cyber compliance frameworks, then being CMMC compliant should be a small spend for you to upgrade to building that enclave the way that the DIB wants it built.
Got it. All right. So knowing that there's likely going to be at least a review, if not some actionable, changes to the entire federal government regulatory bureaucracy, which will almost guaranteed touch the Department of Defense. And it may or may not impact CMMC. I don't know. I'm reading a lot, and there's so much speculation out there about what they're going to be. I think there's a ton of waste and over regulation that needs to be cut out. Maybe there's an outcome of this where CMMC actually becomes hyper improved and really good. But right now, could you, Chris, talk about what our guidance would be for an MSP who has maybe a handful of DIB clients who just have tons of questions? They don't want to lose these contracts, but they're also not going to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get certified at level 3 and wait for how long, it's going to take the auditor or assessor to come on site and do their work. How would we guide and help an MSP guide their customers in this kind of uncertain transition period?
I would advise the MSP to tell their customer that the process of writing policy-driven compliance is going to get you almost all the way there right off the bat. If you have a customer who is working with the DIB and they need to build an enclave so that they can stash the ball bearing schematics that we were discussing about earlier, have them write out policies or help them write a policy that says only this person who's a domestic worker can be privy to where this information is stored. He or she is the only one who has access to log in, and it could be a team. It's most likely going to be a team of them, but building out and scoping where all of that CMMC specific language is going to sit is the first step in adapting to that environment. So having that policy-driven compliance, because in a policy, you can articulate who, what, where, when, and how that information is stored. And that's all they're looking for. They're looking for somebody to be responsible for that information. That's where that responsibility component of the shared responsibility matrix is going to come into play for you as the MSP.
Yeah. That's really good advice. So I think the MSPs out there paying attention, their ears hopefully perked up and they saw this is an opportunity for us, either through our consulting advisory, maybe a CIO or a compliance service offering they have, or maybe thinking of spinning up in the new year. They might be thinking correctly. That's the conduit for delivering that guidance. Could you walk us through the structure. You mentioned like shared responsibility. We have a phrase here called managed controls. Maybe walk us through at a high level how an MSP, maybe even one not certified or compliant or who's never been through a certification or audit before, walk them through a realistic path in 2025 to start helping customers in the DIB of theirs get to a point where they can be prepared for CMMC, whichever way CMMC goes. That's a lot, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so with the end goal being an assessment or a certification from the CMMC community, then an MSP would advise, and firstly, the first thing they're going to do is make sure that they are compliant with CMMC, because you can't manage the way that the CMMC certification works is if your MSP managing the customer's CUI, or at least managing the enclave that the CUI is hosted in, then that system needs to be CMMC compliant. If it's FCI, it's at a level 1 compliance. If it's CUI, it's at a level 2 compliance. And so using the UCS as an MSP specific standard that maps to all 110 level 2 controls, you could start there and start by getting certified yourself. And when you're certified in the UCS, you're now having a tested control that's been tested by an independent third-party auditor, and that control can then be delivered downstream to the CMMC client in the form of a shared responsibility matrix inside of the CMMC world, what we call managed controls inside of CyberVerify. And so with the end goal being a efficient mechanism to deliver compliance to that CMMC seeking certification or seeking assessment, an MSP can demonstrate their own compliance. And then that is going to eliminate a lot of the headache that the customer is going to have to go through when it comes to not only implementing the cybersecurity framework, but also reading and understanding what those controls mean when they're presented with that SRS module that they have to go and then fill out in the government website.
Right. For the self-attestment. You are not saying MSP reads the 100 plus controls for CMMC and then advises customer in the DIB to go and get started with checking those off in a spreadsheet. You're starting with the MSP has a huge role and a huge impact on those customer controls. So MSP first gets tested under the UCS, then they have necessarily met and mapped to those CMMC controls. And then when they go and advise their customer, the customer has the benefit of what, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60%, depending on the engagement model of their controls have already been tested, if I heard you right.
That's correct. That's right. And so for those, because the MSP is going to be able to deliver, if they're compliant themselves, they're going to be able to deliver a tested and verified control to the CMMC client. And for those remediations or for those improvements that the CMMC client is going to have to make, and that's the POAMs. And we've heard the POAM, which is that plan of action and milestone, which is, hey, here's what I'm not meeting. Here's the budget I have carved out to meet it. And then here are my milestones. And here's where I'm at currently. So the MSP is going to be an expert in delivering that consulting and that advisory role on how that POAM needs to be implemented for the customer.
I would imagine, in addition to helping the client with those policies, you talked about that policy-driven approach, not a control-driven approach. This process is going to shake out a ton of those AS 400 legacy gap or security risk areas that we've talked about, and really allow that MSP to start to do what you said, create a plan for 2025 or beyond, and say, look, you're not ready to get CMMC because you're still sitting on a database that's written in some weird code that we can't monitor this, right? So we need to upgrade. This is a project. We need to recommend putting you in a cloud. Maybe it's Azure, maybe it's AWS, whatever. And then you're really having some very concrete, defined conversations that are not compliance. Compliance is the undertone, but it's really about, hey, we need to upgrade your infrastructure. And I think that's a much more comfortable area for MSPs to operate in.
Yes, I agree. Ultimately, the goal is to improve our security posture for other countries coming in and taking that data from us and stealing that CUI and that data that's seemingly readily available. But that the MSP is truly the front line of defense when it comes to making the stand against them.
Yeah. And just because I think a lot of people know our work over 20 years of certifying MSP organizations, but you and your team here at MSPAlliance, you're doing so much work, not just on MSP certification, but you are helping a lot of MSPs who are then in turn, not exclusively to CMMC, but this is our topic for today, but they are helping their CMMC impacted customers. You guys are helping with, policy templates, giving them guidance on what they should be helping their customers with. That I know that's a lot of what the team does every single day.
Yeah, we understand what is necessary for an MSP and what's not necessary. And so applying what I would call a common sense filter to some things is necessary. And what we'll see in the future in 2025 as the transition takes place and we see an increase or decrease of seriousness towards the CMMC framework, what's going to happen is the common sense filter is going to get applied to that. And the MSP is going to be the one that delivers that, because the DIB is going to say everybody needs to have centralized access management and implemented inside their framework, and nobody can, you have to have it completely sanctioned off. And the MSPs, the customer's going to say, well, we can't afford that. We're not doing that. So find somebody else to make the ball bearing. And then the MSP is largely going to be the regulatory driver for how that framework adapts, because every cybersecurity framework goes through version 1 or version 2 or revision 1, revision 3. So we're going to see a CMMC 2.2.1 probably Q 2025.
Yeah, I think that's probably highly likely. But what I like about what you said is that it doesn't really matter how the testing, the assessment, or the manifestation of the evaluation of the controls or the organization's changes. What I like about our approach is that you help the MSP first, right? I look at it as you got to, in commercial air flight, right? When they talk about losing cabin pressure, right? You always got to put your mask on first, and then you take care of your kids or your parents or whatever next, right? Same thing with an MSP, right? You have to get your control mask on first. You can't help anybody until you have that on. And then you start helping that CMMC customer put their mask on. And I like that approach because it is the most flexible and powerful approach for MSPs today to do their part in raising the defense of the defense industrial base, which needs to be done. It will be done. I don't think any of us knows how it's going to be done yet.
Good point.
We'll see. Yeah, time will tell. Hey, if you are interested in talking to Chris and our team about getting your MSP practice certified, if you are interested in getting your customers compliant with the CMMC set of controls, definitely reach out to us and we'd be happy to help. But hopefully this gave you a little bit of more common sense, rational approach to what we are going to be saying. Yes, we're going to see deregulation. We are going to see it at the very least a review and a scrutiny of how we spend money in the federal government. But that shouldn't pause any type of action and activity and planning on your part to help you and your customers get more secure, more transparent in what you do, and ready to answer questions if and when that day comes. So, hey, Chris, really appreciate you jumping on the program.
My pleasure.